it is time for May 2023 question and answer session. Thanks to all patrons for continuing to support Adept Play, including this minor feature. And to everyone who participates at the website and otherwise in this whole endeavor, patron or not, it is working out, and I am enjoying it. Well, here we have, let's see. First, you may see a shift in lighting and possibly garb if I have to continue tomorrow. I am amply supplied with questions this time, including a real whopper that I'll do now. And if I survive in terms of time and psychology, then I will probably have to, delay the rest of it to another recording. So in which case, you might see me transform before your eyes. Okay, that stated, everyone properly oriented. What is this question? Well, it's a follow-up. The question last month concerned a superhero game, Aberrant, and a little bit of talk about myth. Kind of almost a throwaway comment, which then turned into a question in the patron responses from Mark. And he asks an extremely straightforward question. Because I sort of diss Joseph Campbell, something that I have done more than once over the years, and Mark pops in after I have made such a comment and says, who are some myth and pop culture scholars other than Campbell you'd recommend? And in the comments, I responded with a little bit of a breakdown of what that terminology might mean, and realized, look, I'm just going to have to call that a question for the upcoming month, which is now. So here we go. First, to review slightly what I broke down for Mark in those comments, maybe even amending it a little bit now that I've thought about it some more. And then I will actually name some names and provide maybe some context for why. Okay, first of all, when we talk about mythology, what is that word? And I will break it into three parts. And the first one, we're not really going to concern ourselves with. It's really, really interesting, but it's not the main one, or it's not the main thing. So myth or mythology can refer to something that the speaker is calling out as false. So we can say the myth of American exceptionalism. We can say the myth of an East and a West, right? In some sort of vast cultural, global, conflictual terms. We can talk about the myth of whiteness. We can talk about a wide variety of them, actually. If we turn to pop culture, I mentioned in the comments ninja, the myth of the ninja, whose origins, or its origins are easily traceable through the 1970s and not particularly difficult. But for whatever reason, this, as well as those other somewhat more significant things I just mentioned, they all have they all have staying power. And I think that's part of what is being referenced when somebody calls this a myth, not because it's so obviously incorrect, because it is obviously incorrect, but that it is nevertheless really super persistent. I mean, really like embedded. It's like thunks into someone's head, and they basically are in the state of saying, I don't care what the facts are. I just know this, or it's obvious, or it is. Okay, well, that's a lot of time I just spent on something I said wasn't the focus. But we're acknowledging that as a meaningful application of the word and its potential relationship to pop culture. Okay, what about the parts of myth or the modes of myth that I am interested in? One of them um, definitely looks back to ancient sources, or from the perspective of the user, very, very old. And the idea being that there are recognizable content. There are bits of content or names or imagery, any number of things that we see today invoked as a meaningful bit of culture. I mean, it has communicative power. It is brought forward in some way in modern interactions. So there are a couple of ways, and again, in keeping, I'll mention one, if not to dismiss it, but at least to point out that it seems a little basic. And that's when, somebody invents a line of toys and casts about for something exotic and old sounding, possibly, reaching across to a faraway culture, certainly to a faraway time, and often to another, culture from where you plan to sell this thing. And it will seem very exotic. It will seem scholarly, even, or more profound in some way. One of the examples I gave was to provide all those, Gnostic angel and entity names to the characters in Super Robot Fighter, right? So now we have Mecha, called Ealdabaoth, stuff like that. And that's great in its way. I mean, or it's not so great in its way. It's straightforwardly appropriation, and it's straightforwardly, I guess, the in its original critique, the term is called Orientalism because it's specifically talking about European and American, reaching to the exotic East for things. In that particular case I just mentioned, it goes the other way. Clearly, it doesn't really matter, which way or from whom, except in terms of power. Well, anyways, that's kind of interesting. I mean, we could look at the Mighty Thor in Marvel Comics, right? Somebody says, ooh, that's old, that's cool, it's got a few features that are, visually kind of awesome, and we'll just lift that up and we'll do it whatever way we want. And to some extent, there's even a playful quality to that. I mean, it's not despicable necessarily. Mileage differs on that one, depending on, whose ox is gored, certainly. Well, anyway, with all that stated, what about more significant forms of this thing where we're looking back on like ancient stuff? A really important one is when you can actually see a through line. You can basically see the thing undergo transformations through culture and through use and through meaning, and it persists, and there are certain aspects of it that aren't lost, and then there are other aspects of it that jump all around depending on what use or what meaning it has at a particular time. An interesting entity called Jesus or Jesus Christ would seem to be an excellent example. Never mind seem, that is an excellent example. In the comments from last time, I mentioned a slightly more minor example, which is the Hippocratic Oath. So people can point and say, well, back in those ancient Greek days, they did this thing, or classical Greek anyway, they had this thing, and it has persisted, through the centuries as this guiding principle of, well, somewhat more accurately, it's been appropriated multiple times for multiple different means, and in multiple different depictions or phrasings or understandings of the phrasings. But still gaining a weight, just like Jesus gaining a weight in modern use because of its presumed continuity, to antiquity, or at least past the point that most people think of as the memorable or recoverable past. So this is of some interest when something does that, and instead of just new terms, or local terms just hopping in and being used, there seems to be this need to, reach back. Does that actually mean that the thing itself has, if you will, a forward momentum or a driving power that makes that happen? That's a matter of some debate. This is relevant, that debate, because you can kind of switch it around a little, where you're looking at the content or some aspect of the content, which seems to be the persistent part, and then local terms and symbols and things get piled onto that and might be even completely renamed or partly renamed or mutated or distorted in some way so that somebody who looks can spot the continuity, but it's not immediately apparent to those people using it. And in this case, this is where the content is considered to have the continuity rather than just the name or a specific imagery. So they're kind of opposites. And this is a matter of great scholarly attention. This is where this exact thing, where you say, well, there is a principle or there is a meaning, which is not only just repeated through human use and what humans are and what culture is, but is non-independently continuous. There's this, so the different instances aren't independent, they are continuous, and things just get kind of repackaged or rebranded in ways that make more sense to the people in that place. To what extent this applies to familiar popular culture is of some interest. And I point to a few number of these, sort of whether it's one or the other, whether it's the name and imagery that's persisting and getting repurposed for very different things, or whether it's the other way around, where you have a particular thing or meaning which gets repurposed in its names and imagery. These are of great interest to people who study superheroes. And it's also important in terms of their careful use and interest in the word myth, in the sense of a very heartfelt experience of people actually using these things or experiencing them. They care. There's a great deal of caring, a great deal of personal gathering to oneself of these meanings. Okay, one could very easily look at the number of books published about the Jewish qualities of American superheroes. The attention has been devoted to characters, especially who are not in the literature tagged as Jewish, so Superman in particular, and Spider-Man as well. It becomes a little less interesting to me when a character is either retroactively or semi-retroactively established as Jewish or is introduced as such. The one that seems to kind of be most in the context that's the most interesting is when the character is not so designated, and yet the scholarly or the reader interest taps into those qualities that take on importance to them related to that person's or that subculture's relationship to Judaism. So there's a lot of books about that and a lot of debate on just how valid the interpretations may be, or how many ifs or how many circles and arrows are being drawn in the air to justify this. And I would turn to, if you really want to go into that, I would turn to my blog posting about this very issue. That brought me to contact with a scholar named A. David Lewis, who has a blog called Sacred and Sequential, and published a book with Christine Hoff-Kramer called Graven Images, which is a whole collection of essays specifically about a fairly continuous concept of antiquity and imagery and meanings as manifested throughout superheroes. And there's a lot of different viewpoints across all the articles in that book, and as expressed at the blog and referenced, outwards from there. And they aren't messing around. I mean, these are religious scholars with, degrees and postings and stuff like that, and they are debating it fairly intensively. So that would be where I'd suggest to go. Lewis and interrelated, scholars and debates about that. And a lot of it is really is quite available. So if we take now a step bigger, I mean, if that's not enough, if we take a step bigger, that's where the discussion that Mark is drawing upon really started with. By bigger, I mean myth as a powerful thing. So I'm stepping into a whole new category. This is the third of my basic categories. And here you have almost a personal cosmos or a cultural cosmos that has incorporated mythological content, and that it is not merely a detail that one might have adopted or be affected by in terms of a particular story or character, but a piece of a worldview. When one says one's mythology here, it's exactly the opposite of that first thing I mentioned. Well, anyway, it's a big deal. It is very much a truth to that person. So maybe it has more in common with that first thing I dismissed in the first place. But regardless, I'm starting to free associate. Let's stick with what I'm talking about. Here we have this almost cosmological notion of mythology, which is maximal in meaning, not just for a person, but for the culture in which they identify and in which others identify them as placed. It immediately, I mean, this designation of mythology immediately splits into two. I mean, really, really different approaches for what it even is. The first one is effectively mystical and is most associated with Carl Jung, and the plethora, of developments and other people's work that gets kind of folded in. Most people know that Jung was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud, that they at first collaborated greatly in the formation of psychology as a discipline, along with a number of other people, and that they specifically had a famous falling out. Jung was extremely committed to a spiritual aspect to the human mind and its shared features across people, and that to him mythology was very much a real thing, that miraculous aspects of reality were an experienced thing. So when he says symbol, he means something extremely magical. And then, if one doesn't like the word magical because it sounds childish, then you say, mystic, or then you use his term and say archetype. And these things, however, are considered to be external. Or if they're external to humanity, then they're because humanity is all thinking and feeling together, but they are deeply real. So that way of looking at it says that mythology that we can identify, that this character goes and kills that monster, is just the tip of the iceberg of the totality of human experience and psychology, all kind of interacting with one another and operating off of these powerful forms. So Joseph Campbell is a Jungian, or was. I want to emphasize that The Hero with a Thousand Faces dates back to 1949. So that's a long time before Star Wars, just in case anybody was a little confused about that. And that this approach is extremely attractive. I mean, Joseph Campbell is widely cited as one of the most influential authors around, and is appropriated, I guess, is the best thing I can say. I mean, bits and pieces of that book in particular are scattered through, academic and popular culture everywhere. But I will say this, that the mystical aspect of it, and Jungianism in general, effectively keeps it out of a lot of scholarship. And if you sand away that aspect of it and say, well, we're not really talking about mystical presence, we're not really talking about metaphysics, then you basically lose that's a hard line to cross. You cross that line and you just basically lose an enormous amount of the content, because without that, you have to start talking about what is real and what does have cause and how does this actually work. And that's exactly what, the Jungian approach is not interested in. I know how it works. And it is in that other realm. So Campbell falls into that category. In and of itself, by itself, that feature divorces me from him, if we're speaking personally. I have no truck with Wu. I'm not interested in the ineffabilities and the metaphysics of anything. And so you can say that's my personal trip, and you'd be right, but I'm not alone in that. It means that we read Campbell, we say what about it is interesting and useful from, if you don't mind the phrasing, an intelligent point of view, and we use that, or recognize how that is, did he point out something that I hadn't thought about? Okay, let's go look at that. But not the fundamentals of where it's coming from as an argument. Because as soon as you dig into that and you're walking around in, oh, wow, you're just in oh, wow land. And so this is my little footnote. That's why I'm often dismissive toward Campbell as a whole. Now, I did grow up with that book. I mean, The Hero with a Thousand Faces was on my parents' bookshelf, and I thumbed through it 1,000 times as a kid. And so I'm not unfamiliar with it, and it was on that bookshelf for a reason. I mean, the people were fascinated by this stuff, and continue to be. I like tarot cards as much as anybody. Do I think that, the Hanged Man or the Magician or the Empress or whatever are ineffable, entities that exist in a metaphysical space, that the human minds and human cultures, tap into? No. Okay, so that's my personal footnote about that. But for the moment, let's not throw out all the babies with that bathwater. Any number of people have applied this way of looking at things in ways that we think are, or that I think are potentially constructive. Now, this isn't so much to do with pop culture, but Robert Bly, for example, had a long career of therapy and workshops and stuff like that. And personally, I think he was in the zone of functionality for that stuff and not in the zone of scams and manipulations. Most famous book is probably Iron John. He mostly used fairy tales as his model. And he was very much in the Jungian tradition. I mean, that's where he was coming from. His approach was utility-based, oriented toward people being able to reorient their lives and decide where they are in their personal stories and stuff like that. So is this all trash? Well, I don't know. There seem to be applications that I look at in functional form and say, oh, well, kind of cool someone's doing that. So anyways, What about that other way of looking at this cosmological myth? Well, it is precisely the opposite. I mean, it is brutally material in its outlook. Um, and the word mythology is employed specifically in the term of, well, a person walks through life and they have to construct a mythology in which to operate. And that is a human cognitive act and a social one, which is reinforced by the web of power, exploitation, pain, and wealth that all of us operate in. And so, therefore, one is constructing this, yes, but one is also being fed a tremendous cosmology. And here, the word symbol takes on a very different meaning in that it is a communication that lacks content, but you feel like it has content. Or the meaning that it has that is being communicated is not really true, but it has all fit together in the cosmology, and you see that symbol and it means that thing, which is probably serving the interests of someone besides yourself. Um, the theorist that really spawned this, even in fact was short, powerful book is even called Mythologies, is Roland Barthes. And a lot of people have worked off of this in a wide variety of ways. There's some affinity here with the works of Foucault, but frankly I don't know just how those two interrelate. I like talking about Barthes because he happily jumped into popular culture as where he wanted to be in talking about this. He was far more interested in pop culture and advertising than he was in any grander, set of symbology or anything that was intellectualized. His work on pro wrestling in particular, that book was published in 1950, by the way. And the section on pro wrestling is just key, fantastic, just phenomenally applicable, right up to the present day, and is exactly what he's very clear on exactly what he's talking about. I'm not a huge scholar of all the ins and outs. The particular approach he used is called semiotics, and instead of the word symbol, he uses the word sign to distinguish it, I think, from that other more mystical point of view. Anyway, the short book that I've always felt was incredibly strong was published in 1979 by Dick Hebdige, and it's called The Meaning of Style. And it's not about superheroes, and it's not about movies particularly, but it is about music, and it's about the origin of punk, and is brilliant. I mean, just an astonishing application of Barthes' views or arguments, just an astonishing application of it that I find entirely convincing and a little bit world changing. You look at it and you go, oh, well, crap, so that's how it works. And I should also point out there is an extensive application of semiotics to movies. Strangely, and I have delved into that, by the way, with academic guidance, and it ain't so good. I mean, that's really a tragedy, if you ask me. There's a variety. I mean, some of that material is quite strong, but a great deal of it, I think, is very simplistic. So, sadly, the exact discipline or branch of the study of myth that I find the most compelling when it was applied into cinema, I didn't find the application, or I didn't find the implementation to be very good. So sadly, I will not point at a whole bevy of cinema scholars who could do up some hardcore semiotics for you. Maybe there are some, but I haven't. I mean, that wasn't my field necessarily, and it wasn't really. Wouldn't call myself a dedicated scholar. I had a huge exposure to all of that, but I didn't delve into it, under what I think of as, developmental academic standards. So I can't say. Maybe there are lots, but the ones that I ran into, the famous ones from the 60s and 70s were not so good. If we did, however, dig a little into the comics, there have been some pretty strong contenders or contributors that I ran into throughout the course of the blogging. And a lot of it had to do with Black American issues. So Adelufu Nama's Super Black is a good example, and so is Black Women in Sequence by Deborah Elizabeth Whaley. So those are, two good examples of saying, okay, mythology as pretty much construed by the semiotic or Bart tradition, how do we apply this to comics in regard to specific issues of power, exploitation, injustice, and, culture? I think those are two really strong examples. Another one, which isn't about comics, but I know is close to you, Mark, is a book by Eric Green called Planet of the Apes as American Myth. A lot of the blogging that I've done on those topics, both the Superman and superhero and myth stuff, superheroes and religion stuff, and Planet of the Apes, those blog posts that I know you know about are full of references in addition to the ones I've mentioned. So that's probably where I would go. But you see, that is the zone which steps away from mythology as real, well, metaphysically real mythology. And it may be interesting to people that there is one well-known comics creator who, as far as I can tell, has straddled the line. Now, I do not see a gray zone between those two forms of significant myth. So when I say straddle the line, that means basically you stand on one leg for a while and talk over there, and then you put your weight over on the other leg and talk over here, and you don't really reconcile them as much as you may feel you are because you're one person. But that's, the person in question may differ. I am, of course, talking about Alan Moore, who will hold forth on much about mythic meaning of things. And he, in my opinion, is also quite articulate and makes perfectly good sense when he talks about things in the more semiotic or non-metaphysical approach as well. Whether those two things actually make sense at the same time, I don't think so, but that's his business. I hope this has kind of gotten somewhere. I'll leave the whole issue of, Star Wars, is it myth, isn't it? Well, apply, whichever school of thinking you want. I will point out that when the references begin with some Hollywood director sounding off about something that he heard about from some guy, I'm just not very interested, in following up on whether, Star Wars was intended as an homage or an application of Campbell or not. Well, Hollywood people say anything and everything whenever, so I don't really care. I hope that is at least, however, of some interest to somebody, what I've walked through here. And I hope it went some way toward answering the basic question of, well, who are some scholars that you would recommend, or what are you thinking about in terms of scholarship when you look at this stuff? So there you go.